Hello everyone, my name is Alyan and today I have very special guest and my today guest is Miss Jenilee. Okay, so how are you Miss Jenilee?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I am also fine, thank you so much for asking. First of all, I am very thankful to you for giving me your precious time.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much. Before moving on a question, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Jenilee. I live in Texas, USA, and I am the podcast host of Java with Jen podcast, Hearing God's Voice for Everyday Life. I also coach new podcasters who are hoping to start a show, and I also have a podcast network called Imagine Media Podcast Network. So,
That's great, awesome, wonderful. Okay, so my first question in your screen, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your journey into starting the Java with Jen podcast?
yeah, absolutely. So I started it years ago because I grew up from a young age wanting to teach the Bible and teach people just all sorts of things. And I wanted to have a voice, but I found that culturally and both within the religious culture as well as the part of the US that I'm living in, that as a married person, people took my husband seriously as a preacher, but didn't necessarily give me a lot of opportunity to do that. And so I decided to start a podcast because, I was aching and yearning on the inside to have a voice and have a platform and speak into the lives of people. And if nobody else was going to give me one, well, I was going to create one. So that's why I started my podcast.
That's great, really wonderful. Okay, so what inspired you to merge your faith and your passion connecting with people into a podcast?
Well, I mean, the two go very hand in hand, anyways. But when you're passionate about your faith, I think it's very natural to want to share that with people. And people of my faith, I found had a lot of questions surrounding aspects of Christianity and knowing God and hearing God's voice. And I wanted to just help them. I wanted to help them learn the things that I had learned. And it just kind of became a natural outflow into a podcast.
Great, awesome. So, how do you approach decision around spiritual and faith on your podcast in a way that resonate with a diverse audience?
Well, part of having any platform is you do have to hone in on who your ideal audience is. And so while I do have a diverse audience, I speak to a very specific group of people. So on my show, I speak to primarily Christian women who are wanting to deepen their relationship with God. And so that's the people that I have in mind. I do have men who listen to my show and people of other faiths that listen to my show that just find it interesting, but my primary audience is one specific group of people.
That's great. So, could you share an impactful story from your podcast where the message of loving Jesus and loving people really shone through?
Sure. Let's see. I feel like there was one episode. Are you talking about directly related to a podcast episode? Well, I'm not sure if you froze up, so I'm going to go ahead and answer the question to the best of my ability. So there was a podcast episode that I did on marriage and helping people in their marriages, where I interviewed a couple that do marriage counseling. And one of my listeners, she was actually a sponsor of the show. She had a family member whose marriage was in a difficult spot, and so she had been praying for them for quite a long time. And when she heard my episode, she realized it was very valuable for the situation that they were in. And so she sent my episode over to them and they loved it. And they actually contacted the people that I had interviewed and got in touch with them. And that couple was able to counsel with this other couple through some of their marriage issues. I mean, they were ready to end their marriage. They were on the path to divorce. It looked very hopeless until they worked with this couple that was able to pray with them and counsel with them. And then the husband decided that he realized he really needed Jesus in his life, and that through the love of God and the empowerment that Jesus gives us to overcome our weaknesses, he was able to be a better husband. And so he not only had joy and peace in his heart from giving his life to Jesus, it brought a renewed love between the two of them, and it restored their marriage. And now the two of them are happier than ever and are serving in their church and praying together. And it was just such a beautiful story, all initiated from one of my podcast episodes. I was so grateful to hear that testimony.
That's great. And they
You're cutting out pretty bad, so I don't know if that's just on my end, but I'm going to just answer the question as I read it. Okay, so my podcast tackles the topic of hearing God's voice for everyday life. So in the Christian faith, we believe that God is alive. He lived before, but then he died, and then he was raised from death back to life by God. And Jesus is the Son of God. He's the one who died and was raised back to life. And because he lives, he left his spirit with us. And his spirit comes into our hearts when we give our life to Jesus. And because of that, he promises to be our counselor, to guide us through life, to give us wisdom, to give us hope, and to give us the ability to love when it's hard to love. And basically, he comes and he gives us strength in all the areas where we're weak. And so hearing God's voice and hearing the voice of his spirit is a very important part of successfully living and walking a Christian life and enjoying that process. And a lot of people, because you're learning to hear the voice of the spirit that lives inside of you, it can there's kind of a learning curve, a little bit of a learning process to learning to recognize when God is speaking to you, or when it's your own thoughts or your own heart, or whether it's, just from the influence of culture around you. And so a lot of Christians know that in reading their Bible, in prayer, and in worship, they can get some wisdom and guidance from the Lord. But a lot of them don't understand how to hear his voice in a very specific way, such as, when I was choosing whether or not to marry my husband, I wanted the wisdom of God, who knows my future and knows me best and has good plans for me. I wanted to know from God himself, is this a good idea? And so I needed to be able to hear the voice of God for my life in a way that, the Bible doesn't specifically say Jenilee should marry Stephen. It's not written in there, And so that's where it's pertinent and important that we learn to hear God's voice. And so I, on my podcast, teach people how to hear the voice of God. And there's a number of episodes that I teach that break down actually what that means and how to learn that and how to get better at discerning his voice. And then I have people on the show that share their personal stories and how God and his leading and the voice of the Holy Spirit played a part in their journey, so that people can recognize, oh, everybody's journey is a little bit different, and this is what theirs looks like. So it encourages them in the process of learning to hear his voice in a daily way. It looks like your signal has gone out. I don't know if that means mine did too. All right, we'll keep going. Okay, your audio is gone and your video is gone, but I see the question, so I'm going to go ahead and answer it for you. How do I choose my podcast topics and guests to ensure that they align with my core message of love and faith? Some of my podcast topics come out of listening to the questions of my listeners. If they ask questions or asking about something, I'll speak to that topic. Sometimes it's if I meet someone who's very fascinating and interesting, and I feel like their message would be a benefit to my audience, then I may have them on the show. And a lot of times I will just spend time in prayer and spend time with the Lord and ask him what's on his heart and ask him what he would like to share with my listeners. And then I will put together a message that I got from the place of prayer or from reading the Bible, and I will share that as well. And of course, all of those things are going to align with the core message of love and faith. There we go. I see you again, but you're frozen. I'm ready for you whenever you want to ask your next question,
Okay.
Alyan.
Okay, so in today world, where difference sometimes lead to division, how do you encourage your listener to embrace and love people with different perspectives?
Yeah, we talk a lot. I'm very much of the worldview that disagreeing with people is perfectly healthy and normal, because we're all different and we're allowed to be different, and different is good. It's part of what enriches our human experience. And so I very much encourage my listeners, like, hey, in fact, when someone has a different perspective, lean into it. Lean into it. Try to understand where they're coming from. But ultimately, whenever we disagree with people, we need to land in a place of honor and respect, because they are entitled to their thoughts and their opinions, and they hold them close just as much as I am. And so it really comes down to the principle of treating others like we want to be treated. Well, it looks like it's just me here. Poor Alien. I think that his audio and his signal is weak today, but that's not his fault. So I don't know if I should be talking or waiting. I see we're still live, so it's great to meet everybody. Great to be here. Here he comes. Alien, I'm sorry you're having such a rough time with the signal over there. Should we turn off
Some
video?
part. Sorry, can you repeat?
Should we turn off the video so it's not pulling on the signal so much?
I say it's okay, no problem.
Okay.
Okay, so how has your own faith journey evolved since starting the podcast, and how does it continue to impact your life?
Ah, good question. I mean, my faith journey is always growing and moving, really, despite whether I have a podcast or not. But having a podcast and leading people and realizing that my voice is carrying influence does give me a sense of pause and care that I'm really authentically leaning into the heart of God and communicating what He would want me to communicate in a way that's true and authentic and um, aligned with His truth. And so, I mean, my faith journey is it's a God is my best friend. So that friendship is always there, whether I have a podcast or not. But it has caused me to lean into hearing Him in a different way.
Great, wonderful. So, can you share a personal experience that reaffirmed your belief in the power of loving Jesus and loving people?
Yeah. Oh, I have so many. But the one that comes to mind I can think of is I was at church and there was a woman who came to me for prayer. And so I was praying for her. And the beautiful thing about God speaking to you is that sometimes He can give you insight into what people are dealing with to pray so that there can be a miracle. And so I was praying for her about the issue that she came up to me for. And it was personal relationships and stuff like that. But as I was wrapping my prayer, I got a vision of there being pain in her back or some kind of injury in her back. And so it was very, very quick, very faint. And so I just laid my hand on her back and I just commanded healing into her back and just prayed very quickly. It was not this big dramatic thing. I just prayed very quickly and moved on to the next person to pray for them. And she came back to me about a week and a half later and she said, Jenilee, she said, I came to the altar to pray for this situation. But when you prayed for my back, she said, you have no idea, but I injured my back in a car accident 20 years ago, and I have lived in constant pain since that accident. She said, but when you prayed for me, the pain lifted, and I had a miracle in my back, and I have not had any pain since. And so it's just the power of loving her through praying for her, but God loving on her by knowing her needs. She didn't even come looking for a healing. She came looking for help with something else. And God just showed and demonstrated that He sees her. He sees all aspects of her, so much so that He shared with me that little secret about her life, that she lived in constant pain, and had me pray for her even though she wasn't asking for that, and gave her a miracle. And so it was beautiful. I have so many stories like that, but it was just beautiful. Okay, good question. Practical ways listeners can incorporate the principles of loving Jesus and loving people into their own lives. I mean, it's real simple. Like loving Jesus is, I feel like, we give our heart to Him and treat Him like any other important relationship in our life, where we take time to spend time with Him. We tell Him how much we love Him. We do the things that please Him and live in a way that honors Him, and meaning that I make choices that don't hurt people, make choices that God is a father and people are His children, and I'm a mother. So if someone treats my child kindly, it blesses me. But if someone is unkind to my child, We're gonna have words. You know what I mean? So part of the way I can show God that I love Him is by loving His children, and so practical ways, especially with one another, is being kind when it's difficult to be kind, giving people the benefit of the doubt, listening well when people are talking, just listening and holding space for people to be themselves. Encouraging people, giving them compliments. I mean, so many simple ways to make people feel loved. And that really comes down again to treating others like we want to be treated. And so it's super simple.
Exactly. Okay, so the title Java with Jen suggests a comfortable and social atmosphere. How do you ensure your podcast feel to listeners from various backgrounds?
Ah, yes. Um, you know, I am a very like transparent person. And so on my podcast, I share stories of my own failures and ways that I learned hard lessons. And I think that in itself kind of brings down the pressure. It just kind of makes it feel like you can put your hair down and relax a little bit, like, she's one of us. And people comment frequently that they love that my show feels very authentic. And I just like to keep things very simple. I don't believe in getting real stuffy and professional in a way that feels inauthentic. And so I just genuinely really do care about people and want to help people. And I just feel like when that's the condition of where I'm coming from, it's going to come through on the show.
Wonderful. Okay, so how do you handle moments when you feel uncomfortable sharing comment from guests or listener on your podcast?
um there hasn't been a lot of that because typically people who are drawn to my show are people who think similarly. But there was one person I had on my show who started to share some things that there's a difference between, oh, I see it differently and that's good, or I feel like the things that she was sharing were maybe unbiblical and not lifestyles or concepts that I want to endorse. And so when that's the case, I just kind of graciously let the conversation go. But then in editing, if there's things that are said that I feel like I can't endorse, then I will just edit those parts out. But I never argue with my guests. That's, I don't feel like, very respectful. And then if I have listeners who have a different perspective, I very much believe people have a right to be heard. If they're assaulting and attacking, if they're attacking me, then I don't feel like I have a responsibility to engage in that conversation. I'll shut down the conversation. But if they're respectful and we can have a conversation that's respectful, then everybody has a right to be heard. And so I try to make the time to hold space for how different perspectives may be.
Exactly, great. Okay, so my last question in your screen. Looking ahead, what are your aspirations for the Java with Jen podcast and the message you are spreading about love, justice, and loving people?
Yes. Well, I my goal and my desire is that I hope that when people come across my podcast, they are inspired to see God in a more approachable way. I think a lot of times people view God, and we the fear of the Lord is real. Like, we need to respect God. I mean, He is God. He made the heavens and the earth. He made us. He made everything that we see. And so there has to be a respect for who he is and the power that he holds. But he also came to earth as a human and died a human death so that he could be relatable to us and so that we could come into a relationship with him. In fact, the Bible says that he has known all of our suffering just as we have. And so he wants to be relatable. And so my desire is that when people encounter my show, that they would see God in a way that is, oh, He's not just a religious deity. He's not just a religious idea. He's a person, not a human, but he's a person. He's someone I can have a relationship with, someone who knows my name, someone who sees everything about my life and loves me still and cares about me and has a plan for my future. And so I want people to be inspired to make a connection with God, to be inspired to try to hear his voice, and to be unintimidated, and not feel afraid that they're just going to be judged. I always tell people that God knows everything about our life anyways, and he is the most loving and safe place to make mistakes. He in the times when I've made my worst mistakes, that is when I've experienced him being the most patient and the most kind and the most gracious. And I want people to see that side of God when they encounter my podcast. And I would love for my podcast to be heard all around the world. It's listened to in 80 countries, and it is a top 1% globally ranked show. And so there are a lot of people listening, which I'm so thankful for. And so now that I've been on your show, maybe some people from your country will begin to listen too.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. Alyan, can you hear me? Alyan,
I can't hear anything you're saying.